Okay. All right, so we will go ahead and get started for this afternoon. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. My name is Marlene Linares Gonzalez. I am the Communication and Outreach Coordinator here at the Latin American and Iberian Institute at the University of New Mexico. The LAII, as we call it, promotes and supports interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and so we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as the global discourse through our public programming. We'd like to take a moment to recognize the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia on which UNM sits. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land and throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples as a whole. And finally, thank you to UNM Press for their collaboration and support for today's lecture. I'm honored and excited to introduce Carrie Ryan today, Assistant Professor of Latin American History at St. Norbert College, and the author of Our Indigenous Ancestors, A Cultural History of Museums, Science, and Identity in Argentina, 1877 to 1943, which she will be speaking on today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for being here today for a Zoom lecture of all things. I really appreciate it. Thank you also so much to the Latin American and Iberian Institute and to the University of New Mexico, and very much to Marlene for arranging this and inviting me to be here today. This is the fun stuff, right? Of the work that we do as teachers and scholars and students, is getting to meet new people and talk about history, share ideas, things like that. So I'm looking forward to this. Let me apologize in advance because my dog is already losing her mind in the background. So I'm just going to ignore her, and I hope that you will be able to as well. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. I have a presentation that I want to help walk us through. Okay, so this is the book that I'm going to be talking about today. This is the most recent book. This is an edited anthology. I did not write this book, but I did edit this book. This is The Conquest of the Desert, Argentina's Indigenous Peoples and the Battle for History. So what I'm going to talk about today are my own chapters, my own research and work in this book, but I'm also more than happy to talk about any of the other contributions to this book. And I've actually put a table of contents at the end of my presentation. So if you want to see what else is in here and ask some questions about those chapters, I hope you'll ask. So thank you very much. All right, so let me begin where the book begins, which is with this statue. So in the Centro Cívico Plaza of San Carlos de Bariloche, which is a city in Argentina, I don't know if you can see it here. Can you see my cursor? Okay, excellent. Bariloche is here. Buenos Aires is over here, just to give you a sense of scope for that. Okay, so in a public square in the city of San Carlos de Bariloche stands an equestrian monument celebrating Julio Roca's role as the commander of the conquest of the desert, which in Spanish, of course, is La Conquista del Desierto, which ran from 1878 to 1885 in terms of official numbers. And this was a series of military campaigns launched by the Argentine forces to drive indigenous peoples from the southern Pampas and Patagonia. For many people in Argentina today, Roca is a national hero, and the conquest is understood and is often described as an unfortunate, somebody use finger quotes there, like unfortunate necessity in Argentina's history that paved the way for progress, national unity, things like that. And that's the story that this monument is meant to convey. But this monument also tells a different story. Bariloche is located in territory that was targeted militarily by the conquest of the desert, so the sort of southern Pampas and Patagonian, northern Patagonian region. These are territories that were the target of the military campaigns of the conquest. And Roca's monument is regularly spray painted, as you can maybe see a little bit here, with slogans like Roca equals genocide, the Mapuche people live, assassin, justice, oppressor, and slogans in Mapuzungún, the Mapuche language, like Marichi Hueo, which means 10 times the victors. The monument is also frequently splashed with red paint. Maybe you can see that here on the horse, especially, that it's been splashed with red paint, symbolizing the blood of indigenous peoples that was spilled during and after the conquest of the desert. And Mapuche activists stage regular protests surrounding this particular monument. So Mapuche activists and anonymous graffitists' insistence that the Mapuche people live, for example, El Pueblo Mapuche Vive, and their forceful denunciations of Roca's role in displacing the indigenous peoples of the Pampas and Patagonia all suggest the conquest of the desert's powerful historical legacies and ongoing relevance in Argentina today. And in fact, it's in the news currently right now this week. So I'm going to sort of truncate what I would present at the end of this talk to try to talk about what's in the news right now about the legacies of the conquest of the desert. For more than 100 years, the conquest of the desert has marked Argentina's historical passage between eras. The nation's history has often appeared to be naturally divided along the pivotal axis of 1880, which is the end of the first sort of salvo of military campaigns of the conquest. It was also the year, 1880, in which Julio Roca, the commander of the conquest, this guy right here, was elected to the presidency of Argentina. Before the conquest, Argentine national histories are most often written in terms of social divisions, economic stagnation, and political conflict and violence. After 1880, traditional histories of Argentina are described in terms of the country entering a golden age of social progress and economic growth and national unity. The conquest of the desert facilitated this abrupt national turnaround to contemporaries by eradicating the indigenous peoples of the southern Pampas and northern Patagonia, thereby solving the quote unquote Indian problem and facilitating the rise of a, again, quote unquote, white Argentina. After the conquest, the Argentine state concretized this narrative in which indigenous peoples had disappeared, and any indigenous peoples who were found living in Argentina after the 1880s were understood as remnants of this doomed race, right? Destined to disappear in the face of civilization. This narrative of inevitable indigenous disappearance, which was portrayed as natural and even universal, right? This is a familiar narrative. We've heard it in places other than Argentina, relegated indigenous peoples in Argentina to the national past. These ideas translated into state policies that undermined indigenous claims to land and other economic resources, political status, and cultural rights, and also invisibilized indigenous peoples, marginalizing them from the national mainstream politically, economically, and culturally. Traditional lifeways were dismantled, broken by military conquest, or slowly weakened through contact with, and often coercion by, Creole Argentine economic systems, political exclusion, and social controls. Despite the lasting legacy of these practices, however, the conquest did not demographically eliminate indigenous peoples from the Pampas or from Patagonia. Indigenous communities still exist throughout Argentina, and many campaign ongoingly for the recovery of their rights and recognition and identities as First Peoples. Indigenous communities in the Pampas and Patagonia have struggled for things like land rights, cultural recognition, political autonomy and inclusion, and peace in the century and a half, more or less, since the conquest of the desert, but have often found such goals to be elusive, obstructed by the profound legacies that the conquest has left in its wake. The conquest continues today to shape how many Argentines understand their nation's past and present. And although the military campaigns of the conquest ended generations ago, contemporary events in Argentina, like the ongoing protests surrounding Roca's monument in Bariloche, like protests around land rights in Patagonia and in the north of Argentina as well, make clear that the conquest is anything but neutral or distant or past in any real sense. So in my talk today, first, I'm going to provide just a little bit of quick context for anyone less familiar with 19th century Argentine history. And then I'll talk about how Argentines constructed the official story, to borrow a phrase from Argentina's 20th century military dictatorship, the official story about the conquest and how those narratives have left such a powerful legacy in Argentina in the ensuing centuries. All right, so first on this slide, I've given you a couple of things, just sort of again for basic reference. On the left are two photographs from the Pampas today, just to give us a sort of geographical, ecological sense for the landscape that we're dealing with. On the right, this is a map from Argentina's National Institute for Indigenous Peoples, for Indigenous Nations, that gives you a very broad sense for the diversity of Indigenous cultures that live in Argentina today. This map was created, I don't know if you can see this or not, in August of 2021. So this is a really recent map, just to give you a sense again for the persistence of Indigenous peoples. And I've written in the center here, and we'll read aloud a little later, the names of some of the Indigenous groups, either names that they called themselves or names by which they were called in the Pampas at the time of the conquest. All right, so at the time of the conquest, the southern regions of the Pampas and northern Patagonia were home to a diverse array of largely semi-nomadic indigenous societies that called themselves and were described by many names, including Ranculche, Pampas, Pehuelche, Pehuenche, and then moving a little farther south, people like Mapuche and Tehuelche. These are often overlapping categories. And then moving even farther south into Tierra del Fuego at the bottom of the continent, people like the Ona and the Selknam. Many indigenous groups in this broad region, the southern Pampas and northern Patagonia, moved seasonally, relocating to winter and summer hunting grounds, pasture lands, orchards of apples in the Cordillera, and water sources. Many of these groups also adapted their economies and cultures to the enormous herds of feral cattle and feral horses that grew into the millions from the first livestock brought to the region by the Spanish in the 16th century. The Pampas in particular, this kind of fertile grassland over here, proved an ideal habitat for both horses and cattle that late colonial travelers to the region described as moving forests or tumultuous oceans, right? Like sort of presumably furry oceans, right? Like so many cattle that they reached the horizon. Indigenous cultures in the region also developed social and economic systems around the horse and cattle. So these cultures, in many cases, had developed hunting complexes around autochthonous species like the capybara, the guanaco, the nyandu, and they shifted / also embraced cattle and horses as ample sources of food and hides and transportation. Beginning in the 16th century, very quickly, a complex and flexible borderland society emerged between Spanish and then later Argentine settlements in this sort of band between Buenos Aires and moving northwest, first to Asunción and the sort of mission complex that the Spanish established there, and also even further northwest to the mines at Potosí in particular, right? So there's this sort of southeast to northwest corridor. So this frontier line emerged between Spanish and Argentine settlements in this corridor and indigenous peoples living south of that corridor, forging shifting networks, of trade, social exchange, and peace agreements, punctuated by outbursts of violence. The Pampas and Patagonia's wide array of heterogeneous indigenous communities operating independently and in shifting relationship to one another engaged with equally heterogeneous and divided Spanish and Argentine groups to the north that changed in shape and size. In other words, this was not a static space, right? This was a living, flexible, breathing borderland. Even after independence, for much of the 19th century, the Argentine government in its various forms did not make strenuous or concerted efforts to expand the southern frontier. There were sort of sporadic campaigns in the 1800s, but in general, relatively stable coexistence in this sort of network of treaties and alliances with indigenous peoples remained preferable to Argentines and certainly to the Argentine state because they were entangled with issues like internal political instability, civil war, international conflict, economic stagnation, right? All kinds of other things kept them occupied. During the second half of the 19th century, however, Innovations in beef processing and shipping, especially international shipping, right, transatlantic shipping, as well as improvements in wool production, sent export rates for the agricultural and ranching sectors skyrocketing. And these are the economic sectors that were most profitable for the Argentine state, especially as the 19th century progressed. So all of a sudden, these technological developments meant that ranchers and agriculturalists wanted/needed more territory, and this put increasing pressure on that borderland between Argentine and indigenous peoples. So economic pressures to expand Argentine territory southward joined with government efforts to create a legal foundation for that kind of territorial expansion. Close ties between Argentina's ranching and agricultural elites and the state smoothed the path for these strategies, as did 19th century liberal beliefs, right, liberal with a capital L, that political stability and economic growth went hand in hand. Argentine state makers increasingly saw the existence of indigenous peoples in or south of what they called the southern frontier, living outside the control of the nation state in these fertile grasslands of the Pampas in particular, as an unendurable stumbling block to nation state progress, national progress, and to Argentine, state makers, journalists, intellectuals, certainly, state makers of all levels. It seemed clear that something had to be done. Right. So all of this coalesced and sort of came to a head in the late 1870s. And in 1878, the official campaigns of the conquest began. In the many documents that capture contemporary Argentine attitudes about the conquest, and in this particular sense, I'm talking about Argentines, especially Creole Argentines, who were connected with the Argentine state. So we're talking about people from, including newspaper writers, as well as congressional representatives, other government representatives, military officers, people who wrote everything from military field telegraphs to retrospective memoirs about the conquest. These writers demonstrated a shared commitment to a handful of narratives that cast the conquest as imperative, peaceful, humanitarian, and heroic or romantic. So these are the narratives that I want to talk about briefly here. And this image, which I'm going to come back to a couple of times, just as sort of like a mnemonic device, this is a mural in the National History Museum in Buenos Aires by a Uruguayan painter, actually, in the 1890s. And this pictures the main military officers who led the conquest of the desert. It's this historic and heroic panorama of the conquest of the desert, very celebratory. So that's the image that I'm using here. And I'm happy to talk to you more about that if you want to talk about what's in this image and what's not in this image. All right. So first, Argentine military officers and statesmen frequently underscored the imperative nature of the conquest as a means of resolving the immediate and intolerable problems posed by uncontrolled indigenous peoples in the Pampas. Over and over again, and I mean over and over again, authors of military, state, and popular press accounts emphasized that the time had come to resolve these problems for the good of the nation. For example, Estanislao Zeballos, who was a statesman as well as a military officer, as well as a self-taught naturalist, or actually partly formally trained naturalist, wrote about this problem like this. He wrote, "These Indians live by theft and make war against the Christian with cruelty and implacable hatred, as if it would satisfy a horrible vengeance sworn by their ancestors against the injustice with which they were treated. The invasions of our lands leave traces stained in blood and marked by fire and plunder, and in their own toldos, the disgraced prisoners or cautivos are made to suffer horrible and indescribable tortures." So despite the fact that Zeballos mentions briefly here, right, the injustices suffered by indigenous peoples, his focus in this text is on indigenous savagery and the cruelties inflicted upon what he describes as Christian communities along the frontier. Writers like Zeballos built a narrative of indigenous savagery that posed a direct and imminent threat to the nation and therefore stood in urgent need of addressing. And just on a side note, a lot of the sort of state adjacent or state-affiliated memoirs, like books as opposed to articles that I'm going to talk about today, many of these have been printed and reprinted by Argentine presses throughout the 19th century, the 20th century, and many of them are still in print today, and sort of celebrated as these canonical historical works in one way or another. So this first narrative of conquest made it clear to national and international audiences that the Argentine nation was acting in its own defense in a situation of urgent need that could not be ignored or resolved in any other way. And as I'm going through these narratives, one of the things that I find most interesting about them is not their uniqueness exactly, but in fact, their transnational sort of applicability, right? Like these are the sorts of ideas and the sorts of narratives that we see in many settler colonial places in the world, many 19th century conflicts between Western societies and non-Western societies. So part of what makes the conquest interesting for me, apart from the Argentine particular case, is thinking about these questions more broadly and how these ideas get mirrored and sort of like rippled, across the world in this moment. All right, the second narrative that I want to talk about briefly here is the notion of a peaceful conquest, which feels antithetical, but here's how this worked. It was the military's official platform in 1878 that they sought not to destroy indigenous peoples of the Pampas, but to improve them. Violence and killing were to be avoided unless it became inevitable. This Pacific military mantra, this peaceful military mantra, was also incorporated, and this is sort of a side note, into 20th century military historiography. The goal of the conquest, this scholarship has argued, and this has been passed down for generations, not just in Argentina, but in English language historiography as well. And here's an example from the 1960s. This scholarship has argued, quote, "The goal of the conquest was not the destruction of the Indians themselves, but rather their nomadic way of life. And even their dislodgement from the Pampas was but a secondary and alternative objective. The primary objective was to induce them to submit to national authority and to occupy definite fixed places on the Pampas as a permanent, stable, and wealth-producing segment of the national population." So official sources, primary sources on the conquest studiously avoided direct discussion of indigenous casualties and of violence against indigenous peoples. Commanders in the field, journalists, scientists, and others, instead of using verbs like to kill, right, they would use verbs like to clear, to subjugate, or subdue, or finish with, evict, dislodge, or other verbs to discuss military actions against indigenous peoples of the Pampas, marginalizing and even erasing the violence of the campaigns and focusing their accounts instead on territorial and resource gains. In fact, a lot of this official thinking argued that it was the indigenous people's insistence on continuing to live in the Pampas in their quote unquote barbaric state, and to resist absorption into the, again, quote unquote civilized national state that was causing the conflict in the first place, forcing the Argentine military to subdue them in order to achieve their central and, in their minds, patriotic goal of territorial expansion. So an example of this, the president of Argentina at the time, Nicolás Avellaneda, argued before the Congress that the occupation of the Rio Negro does not offer in itself any difficulties. But before bringing it to fruition, it is necessary to dislodge the Indians, and this is coming from the word indios in the original document, of the desert, whose nature it is to conquer, in order to leave not a single enemy at their rear guard, subduing them by persuasion or force, or casting them south of the barrier. This is the principal difficulty. The italics here are mine, just to give a sense again for the pervasiveness of this kind of linguistic choice in these official sources. And yet, as we all know, indigenous peoples did die during the conquest in disputed and often unrecorded numbers, not least because of this discursive or rhetorical practice on the part of the military and the state. Official figures, right, so the numbers that were in fact claimed by the military or reported, claim that the Argentine Army and Navy captured or killed approximately 2,500 male adult Indigenous warriors. State figures also indicated that more than 10,000 women and children were placed under state supervision, which generally meant relocation to Argentine cities like Buenos Aires or Cordoba or Mendoza, the forceful separation of parents from children, especially mothers from children, and the distribution of the captives, adult women typically as domestic servants among the elite families of those various cities. And sometimes the children were also distributed as servants in one iteration or another, and sometimes they were adopted into elite Creole Argentine families and effectively scrubbed of their indigenous identities. They were never told, who their families were or where they were from. State records also showed that over 1,000 people, men, women, and children, were taken as captives to the island prison of Choel, and unrecorded numbers were incarcerated in other prisons or camps, which some Argentine scholars have described, I think compellingly, as concentration camps. Adult men were often forcibly conscripted into military service in the same Argentine military that had expelled them from their own territories, and still others were compulsorily relocated to other parts of Argentina to work as forced laborers in agricultural settings in the north, for example, like in citrus and sugarcane plantations. These figures are by no means complete nor reliable, not least because, again, as Argentine scholars have amply noted, the Argentine state didn't fully record the extent of the violence against indigenous peoples, nor do these figures encapsulate other fates that indigenous peoples encountered. Some fled, for example, to temporary refuges in the south or in the Andean Cordillera. Some were compulsorily relocated to state-created colonias, right, which are agricultural settlements, sort of. They were also Argentina's sort of diagonal, parallel to the reservation system in North America, and if they were relocated to these colonias, indigenous peoples were then expected, or it was hoped, that they would eventually shed their indigenous identities and take on the role of Western agriculturalists. Some indigenous peoples were able to return eventually to the Pampas and Patagonia, and there are many indigenous peoples in those regions today, where they reconstituted new communities, either on public land or state-granted lands. Primarily, these communities are often composed and were often composed of people, of survivors from different indigenous communities, which posed, more challenges, especially down the road, for things like cultural persistence. Okay. A third narrative of the conquest cast it as a humanitarian endeavor to, quote unquote, rescue the indigenous peoples of the Pampas. So this narrative runs in two different directions. One, casting some indigenous peoples at that point living in the Pampas and Patagonia as foreigners or Chilean. So in that regard, the conquest became, in this rhetoric, an attempt to rescue the true or Argentine indigenous peoples from this Chilean invasion. And on the other hand, this narrative underscored the suffering of indigenous peoples, which the military then claimed to be rescuing them from. Military officers' reports and camp journals recorded, for example, indigenous suffering at the time of the conquest in tremendous detail, building a picture of impoverished and helpless indigenous peoples who were in need of rescue. So here's one particular source, and this is, forgive me, a little graphic, so trigger warning there. Families were found that had subsisted on herbs and on cowhides that had to be buried in the ground to soften them to eat. Many died of hunger in their toldos, or their toldo is a Spanish word for awning or awning. All right, so this is a word for an indigenous tent-like structure that was typical of indigenous peoples living on the Pampas and Patagonia. They died in their toldos or along the road to the refuges in the Cordillera. Children with thin legs and bloated bellies were commonplace. In fact, military observers often reflected after the observations of this kind of misery with great satisfaction on the positive impact that capture and ultimately assimilation would mean for Indigenous people. So here's a particularly rosy vision of Indigenous people's assimilation here. Buenos Aires and other cities of the Republic saw the arrival by the hundreds of Indians, and again, this is coming from the Spanish word indios, Indian prisoners. To see those crowds of Indians of all ages and sexes entering the cities humbly and judiciously, distributed among the families, the institutions of education and industry, installed immediately in civilized life, was the most satisfying and moralizing spectacle that could offer itself to a civilized people. The patent transformation of barbarism into civilization, the visible moment of dignifying humanity, the palpable deed of converting the element of destruction into an element of progress. Who would not delight to see a seed germinating in their presence, raising its shoot, its flower blossoming, and its fruit appearing? The incorporation of Indigenous prisoners into Argentine society in this moment, and this is not an unusual or not an exceptional passage, certainly it's maybe unusually explicit, all right, gets imagined in terms both peaceful and voluntary, bringing these Indigenous prisoners into civilized life. All right. A fourth narrative of the official story of the conquest, and the last one that I'll mention today, valorized the actions of the Argentine military and cast the army in particular in heavily romantic terms. One key tactic in building this narrative painted a picture of the intense suffering of the Argentine soldiers during the conquest. So military journals, like diaries, which were later published as historical sources, as well as correspondence, telegraphs, things like that, reflected in the popular press, because a lot of these things were dispatched back to Argentine cities and then printed almost as a live update on the campaigns in these newspapers. All of these reports complained of things like dust, insects, rain, heat, cold, sleep deprivation, bad food, bad roads, and a variety of other things that tested the mettle of the army. One military commander, just for example, wrote in 1879, so during that first round of campaigns, that, quote, "the hardships and privations reached the unlikeliest level," end quote, routinely talking about the miseries of his men. So here are a couple of quotations from this particular military commander's journals, which are another one of those texts that have been printed again and again throughout the 20th and into the 21st century in Argentina. On April 11th, he wrote, "The sun was abrasive, the heat very strong, and as the campaign tents had not yet arrived, all the corps found themselves completely in the open." 3 days later, quote, "the weather continued rainy and the heat was increasingly insupportable. The mosquitoes continued bothering us dreadfully." 2 months later, his complaints shift with the weather. And he wrote, "the weather continues to be cold and windy." And the next day, he complained about the wind, which continues cold and strong. So even as they talked quite a lot about the privations, of campaign life, military and state writers also cast soldiers' sufferings as a proof of their strength. Here we are with this image again, their strength, their valor, their dedication to the nation. As one military commander wrote in April of 1879, quote, "the heat, the cold, hunger, sleep deprivation, it is necessary to resign oneself to suffering everything, when one wishes to achieve a triumph over the savages." And in the same journal entry, he continued on to write, "the Argentine soldier does not have his equal in the world." So military leaders writing about the conquest at the time and in the sort of years and at least the generation afterwards, which then gets passed on generation by generation in the 20th century, paired pride in the resilience of their men, of their officers and their soldiers, with an often spoken certainty of their own inevitable victory, right? This own sort of like historic, romantic, heroic narrative. These documents describe the campaign in strikingly similar terms, right? Describing their actions variously. And I'm going to read you a couple of quick quotations now, and they all come from different people, right? So the conquest was described by various people in the military as, quote, a splendid triumph over the savages, or somebody completely different, a splendid triumph over the Indians, or again, someone completely different, a splendid expedition, exhorting one another that the glory will belong to all. By 1879, the popular press in Argentine cities like Buenos Aires, for example, announced that upon the capture of sort of the last famous indigenous cacique of the Pampas, whose name was Epumer, they reported that, quote, this news is looked on as the close of the Indian question. So there is this sort of like victorious, mission accomplished kind of narrative. All right. So to close, I'd like to talk briefly about why this matters today, right? The conquest's legacies in the 21st century. The conquest of the desert, like I said at the beginning of my talk today, is not a closed question. This is not a neutral historical question. This is something that is still very much at the forefront of politics and society in Argentina today. It remains a source of fierce contestation, its legacies reaching into innumerable spheres in Argentine life. So just, for example, politics, scholarship, land rights, fine art, literature, social movements, education, economic inequalities, cultural memory, and human rights. Disagreements over the conquest still visibly bear the marks of these 19th century narratives and illustrate the persistence of deep divisions, not only around this issue, but around the validity of the narratives that I just described to you. These kinds of debates have appeared regularly in the mainstream national media in Argentina during the first decades of the 21st century, typically eliciting ferocious response. So what I want to do today, as I mentioned at the very start of my talk, is talk a little bit about some of these sort of intellectual debates of the 21st century, and then sort of skip ahead to talk about what's happening in the news right now in Argentina. So first, in 2004, Argentine historian Juan José Cresto published an essay in the fairly conservative, very mainstream Argentine newspaper La Nación, entitled Roca and the Myth of Genocide. Cresto, who was at that point in 2004, the director of the National History Museum and president of the Argentine Academy of History, staunchly defended Roca as a national hero and the conquest of the desert as what he described as a badge of honor. Scholarly discussions of the conquest as genocide, which is something that an entire sort of stream of scholarship in Argentina has focused on, at least for the last 15, 20 years. Cresto wrote of these studies of genocide that these studies, quote, reveal lazy ignorance or conceal interests in territory claims. He argued that the conquest did not invade indigenous territories because, again, his words, these desert lands were first occupied by the Spanish colonizing expeditions of the 16th century. The Indios, and again, I'm using his word there, began their occupation 180 years later. So in short, Cresto claimed that the Spanish were the original occupants of the Pampas and Patagonia, not indigenous peoples. Cresto further underlined that, quote, the law, the expedition, and its organization were discussed in Congress and voted on democratically. The entire country, the entire population of the nation wanted to end this disgrace, from the Congress and the provincial governments to the newspapers without exception. So this image of Argentina as unified, objective or dispassionate, and sort of engaged in civilized debate or discussion really underlie Cresto's central argument. So just to give you another little taste of this here, he concluded his argument with this, talking about the fact that some people believe that the conquest was genocide. He sort of builds this case saying, is it believable that all these people, everybody in the military, everybody in the state, everybody in the popular press, and others who followed the expedition step by step could be silent accomplices in genocide? Is a secret shared by 5,000 people conceivable? Would a humanist like President Avellaneda have allowed it? Cresto argued that it was not believable, and that reasoned scholars could not see the conquest as a genocide because, again, his words here, the only reality is that the Pampean plain was free of malones, raids, indigenous raids, and that the Indians were assigned large reserves. He lamented the rise of scholarly analyses that have emphasized the violence of the conquest, arguing that, quote, people who have not read specifically about the subject or who have other interests, and he means like political agendas, right, had perpetuated this fable, end quote, in order to further their own agendas. He concluded his piece in La Nación with confidence, writing, quote, any serious researcher of history will ask himself in embarrassment, what genocide? Cresto's essay in 2004, again, drew immediate reaction, both ardent support and equally fervent denunciation, and calls for his removal from the National History Museum. The following year, just as a sort of update, I guess, Cresto was replaced as the director of the National History Museum, but he remained president of the more conservative Argentine Academy of History, and he also continued to be a consulted public intellectual and often cited scholarly reference in Argentina. So the ambivalent outcome of such a clear apologia, I guess, for Roca and the conquest begins, I think, to illustrate the continuing conflicts over these nominally historical, right, or past questions, which are in fact not closed at all. During the first decades of this century, so in the last 20 years, obviously, activists and scholars have launched public campaigns to remove a statue of Roca, this one over here, from downtown Buenos Aires, and to replace Roca on the 100 peso bill, which has been done, among other things. Indigenous activists and allies have paint bombed commemorations of Roca, like the statue we saw at the beginning of the talk. I don't know if you can also see in this image that there are also like red paint balloons that have been thrown at this monument in downtown Buenos Aires. Not only in these two places, but around the country, this has happened. And they've also changed street signs saying things like Julio Roca to other names, including Pueblos Originarios, as in this case, actually in both of these cases, either through official channels on the right, you can see that they're actually replacing the street sign, or with spray paint. Okay, so these are activities that are happening at both a grassroots, protest, non-governmental level, as well as a governmental level. In 2012, then President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner announced the replacement of Roca on the 100 peso bill with Eva Perón, which has changed again since then. But as journalists domestically in Argentina and abroad noted, by the early 2010s, Roca, who had once been considered a quote unquote founding father, who gazed from banknotes, adorned plinths, and gave his name to avenues from Buenos Aires to Santa Cruz, now appeared to be falling from grace, as Argentines seemed more willing to engage with the quote unquote, again, open wound of conquest. The battle, however, has proven to be far from over. So let me show you one more thing, and then I'll jump ahead to the present. In 2016, another editorial in La Nación, this time anonymous, praised the quote virtue of this patriotic campaign, the conquest, insisting that no people is really original to any place. Those are their words. And as such, indigenous peoples' quests for restitution, for example, and land rights were illegitimate and unpatriotic. The author suggested that treating the indigenous peoples as different from other Argentine citizens was a sign of corruption or self-interest, right? Like sort of politically motivated venal agendas. He wrote, do I have a slide for this? No, I don't, sorry. He wrote, we are all original peoples. And I shouldn't say he, the person who wrote this editorial said, quote, we are all original peoples, and as such, we should be proud of our past and of sharing a common destiny. We all have last names that reflect migration, rupture, and exclusion. The few local communities that still retain their lineages intact deserve love and care as part of the Argentine people. Their cultures should be integrated and respected, but never used by activists, corrupt politicians, and scammers to collect votes or line their wallets. Okay, so in the interest of time, because I know that I'm running a little behind on this, this has not just been a subject of political activism or legislative action or intellectual debate, right? This is an issue that has concrete effects on indigenous peoples in Argentina today, throughout the country. These are a couple of images from a case study from 2018, 2019 that I have presented in the past when talking about this at a place called Vaca Muerta. So it's here in northern Patagonia down here. It's a place with very rich shale oil deposits, and YPF, the National Petroleum Company, has been fracking in this region for years, which has had negative environmental consequences on the Mapuche communities in and around Vaca Muerta. So there's been this ongoing conflict between the Argentine state, which typically has sided with YPF, and communities like, and the community is not called Vaca Muerta, it's called Campo Maripe, about who really owns this land, or who has the rights to extract minerals from this land, or what kind of rights does this community have when the actions of an extractive petroleum company are negatively impacting their livelihoods, right? But rather than going into detail on that, I wanted to mention, and I don't know if any of you have noticed this or seen this in the press, that Argentina has a law, and it was a provisional law, which was passed first in, I want to say 2014. And of course, I'm not going to remember specifically right now. Hang on a second, I'll look it up. Let's see. 2006. So the law is, if anybody's interested, 26160. And it's a law that was created initially as like a discrete project with a determined end time, in which the Argentine state determined that it was necessary, it was important to go out and actually map indigenous communities' land claims, because even the land that was claimed legally by indigenous communities, legally, right, according to the standards of proof demanded by things like, large landowners in the area, even those lands with recognized and established legal limits were being slowly or quickly encroached upon by non-indigenous actors. So the Argentine state in 2006 established this law to say, all right, we're going to go out and map all of this so that we know who these lands actually belong to. And in the meantime, they legislated a moratorium on evictions of indigenous peoples from those lands, right? So stop all of this. We're just going to go map it. And that law has been extended again and again and again, because the process is so long and so complicated, and the state is, well, there's a lot going on there, right? Like the project seems to go on and on and on for a million reasons, both reasonable and perhaps political. The law is up for renewal again next month in November 2021. And so far, at least to the most recent news reading I've done, that has not happened. And as that deadline approaches, we've seen this rise of confrontation, both in terms of political manifestations and demonstrations, and also in terms of violence and violent encounters between indigenous peoples in Patagonia, especially Mapuche activists and landowners, people who would identify as Argentine Creole, Argentine landowners in the South. And what interests me about this is the language that Argentine government officials who side with the landowners and the landowners themselves, the language that these people are using to talk about the Mapuche activists and their actions in trying to resist land takeovers, or to instigate their own land takeovers in land that they see as themselves. So just for example, in a lot of conservative press in Argentina, these Mapuche activists are often called Mapuchistas, which is the sort of Argentine contraction of terroristas, terrorists, and Mapuche. So they're Mapuche terrorists. And they talk about malones, like they literally talk about indigenous raids and the threat to national unity and security that these indigenous land claims pose. And more than one landowner in places like Santa Cruz have come out on television, Argentine television, and insisted that the government should side with the victims of this conflict. And they mean themselves. They mean the landowners. So that's much more informal than I would usually end a talk like this. But I keep reading about this in the news this week, and I thought, oh, like I don't want to ignore that when I'm talking to you all. So that's what I have for today. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for joining us this afternoon. So now we'll open it up to the Q&A. Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask questions directly, or you can also plop them into the chat and I can read them off to Carrie. So whoever has any questions, please feel free to say them now. Any questions from the audience or comments or anything? I think Russ Davidson had something to say, but it looked like he might have logged off on accident. So
No, that's okay. And it's okay if there aren't.
yeah.
It's fall of 2021.
Yeah. Well, I guess if there aren't any questions, we can conclude it there. And I'm sure that Carrie would be happy, well, I guess I won't speak on your behalf, but happy to receive emails in case that any folks have any questions that come up later on.
Absolutely. I will put my email address in the chat. So if anybody has things that they are interested in talking about, but maybe just didn't want to talk about here, or you think of something later, please feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to chat.
Perfect. Well, just wanted to say thank you again, Carrie. It was a great presentation this afternoon, and I know that we're all very busy. So
I know. Yeah,
we appreciate your time this afternoon. And yeah, we'll conclude it there, and hopefully we can continue the conversation elsewhere. Hopefully, maybe in person one day, but we'll see.
I would like that very much.
Yeah. All right. Well, bye everyone. Have a great day.